Today on Voices for Change, economic disparities laid bare by the pandemic, issues of systemic racism and sexism widening the pay gap for women of color.
Across all of those occupations, we see large disparities in pay between Black women and white men.
Tackling the gender pay gap, a global nonprofit works to break down barriers and move towards equality.
Create workplaces that work for women, because what we found is that when you create a workplace that works for women, it works for everybody.
Plus, addressing housing inequities in San Francisco, the steps being taken to keep people housed during a crisis.
This is the first housing plan in San Francisco that is centered on racial and social equity.
Welcome to this week's episode of Voices for Change. I'm Greg Lee. Each week, we hope to continue the conversation and amplify the message of those calling for reform, social justice, and racial equality. Today, we're talking about the economy, specifically about the pay gap for women of color and income inequality's impact on housing. Thursday marked Black Women's Equal Pay Day. It means on average, Black women in the U.S. had to work 7.5 additional months to make as much as their white male counterparts. According to the National Partnership for Women and Families, on average, Black women make 62 cents for every dollar white men make. Women overall, the statistic is 82 cents per dollar. Also keep in mind the number is even lower for Latinx and Native American women. The Economic Policy Institute has done extensive research on the wage gap. Valerie Wilson, the director of EPI's program on race, ethnicity, and the economy, says the disparity has become especially unjust during the pandemic as Black women are working in many jobs that are critical to our recovery.
Valerie, thanks for joining us. This last Thursday marked Black Women's Equal Pay Day, a stark reminder of a serious pay gap. I know you've done a lot of research on this. Can you tell us some of the numbers that strike you?
Well, Black Women's Equal Pay Day is determined by a comparison of the average annual earnings of a Black woman who works full-time, full year compared to a white non-Hispanic man who works the same period of time. And what we find in comparing those annual earnings is that Black women have to work an additional 7.5 months in order to earn the same wages or same earnings that white men earned in the previous calendar year. And I think that that is really a stark indication of just how wide this gap is and what it means in terms of the effort that must be set forth to make up for that disparity in earnings.
During COVID-19, I know that those inequities have kind of been laid bare. And you point out in your article that jobs at which these Black women are getting paid less are essential to us recovering from COVID-19.
Yeah, the fact is that in nearly every occupation in our economy, we will find these kinds of pay disparities. And I think especially now as everyone is focused on what we need to do as a country to get the economy running again, to make sure that everyone is safe and healthy, many of the jobs that are essential, whether they be in healthcare, whether it be cashiers, whether it be the people who are preparing and serving food, or the teachers and childcare workers that are critical to parents being able to get back to work. Across all of those occupations, we see large disparities in pay between Black women and white men.
Valerie, the other part of that is I know there's concern that when it comes to job loss or wage loss, it could disproportionately impact women of color.
Yeah, the impact of a job loss is magnified by a number of underlying factors. One, we have the 2-to-1 disparity in unemployment rates between Blacks and whites. There's a huge, we're talking about the wage gap now, but there's a huge income gap between Black and white households. The median Black household has about 60% of the income of the median white household. But beyond that, there's a gaping wealth gap, whereby the average median white family has about 10 times the wealth of the median Black family. What that means is that in the instance that you lose a job, Black women in particular, Black families more broadly, have less cushion or less savings or other kinds of resources that they can draw from until they're able to regain employment.
Valerie, I know that Latinx women have not yet marked their Equal Pay Day, and I imagine that that is even more concerning to you and should be to the greater population.
Yeah, again, we mark these dates on the calendar. It really makes it clear how large these gaps are. And I believe Latinx women are going to have the latest equal pay day this year. Typically it comes sometime in the fall.
Valerie, this may be a loaded question, but how do we as a country begin to address those inequities and begin to close the gap?
Well, I think the first step is in acknowledging that they exist and acknowledging that the only reason, or really the only reason that we see these persistent gaps that we can't explain by differences in education or experience is because of racism and sexism that still exist in this country. Again, when we compare women and men with same level of education, the same experience, who live and work in the same region of the country, we continue to see these large disparities. And even within the same occupation, we see these large gaps between men and women. We have to acknowledge the facts of that. And then we have to do the things that are necessary so that we're able to adequately enforce the anti-discrimination laws that we already have on the books so that these gaps can close.
So what is being done to close that gap? Catalyst is a global nonprofit helping companies and CEOs to make workplaces work for women. Bay Area native Serena Fong is their vice president of strategic engagement. She says focusing on the gender pay gap is one way to tackle systemic racism.
COVID-19 has really highlighted the wage gap for women of color and in many cases exacerbated it. What do you see are the barriers still in the way of closing that gap?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question, and thanks for doing this because it is so important, and I don't want it to get lost in all of the concerns, which are very much justified. But the barriers that are facing women, and in particular women of color, and that are exacerbating the pay gap are the barriers that continue to exist and caused the impacts, the negative impacts on women, and in particular women of color. And those are the systemic biases that are baked into our talent management, our advancement, hiring, promotion, recruitment systems right now. Those biases being systemic racism and systemic sexism in particular.
Serena, you outlined 4 real actionable steps that companies and CEOs can take right now and just made it very simple for people. So what are those and why are they important?
Yes, so the 4 steps that, or actions that I recommend and that Catalyst, the organization that I work for, recommends is to conduct internal pay equity studies and analysis because by doing so, you can really examine whether or not you do have a gap, and you also want to have money set aside to close that gap. You also then have to continue to do it regularly to make sure that the gap doesn't reopen or reappear. You need to support pay transparency because what a lot of studies have found is that when women and men negotiate, even if they're using the exact same tactics, women get penalized because of sexism, because of stereotypes. Another action that I think organizations can take, and that is banning salary history requests altogether. Because what they found is that because of the issue around the biases that come up when a woman negotiates versus a man, they will oftentimes come in with a lower salary. So if you base their current salary on what they used to make, they're always going to be lower. So that way, if you ban them, then it helps shrink it and helps make things equal. In fact, there have been 2 recent studies, because I believe California actually has a law that bans salary history requests, and what they found is that it did indeed work to closing that gap. Finally, it's what organizations have to do is evaluate recruitment, promotion, and talent management systems for bias. Because it's interesting, because these days, in terms of the workplace, there's not overt discrimination. It's not the racism that comes out and the sexism that happens is not necessarily overt in a lot of cases. It's really that these are the biases that people have that are unconscious or subconscious. And I'll give you an example. So you have a manager, and it could be a man or a woman, and they have a position that's considered a hot job, one that it's on the promotion track, it's into higher leadership, but it does require that you have to move. They have a male and female candidate who are equally qualified. A lot of times what can happen is the manager will say, well, the woman, she has a family. She's not going to want to uproot her family, and that's going to be really difficult. So I'm going to, in order to protect her and not put her in that kind of position, I'll just figure something out later and then offer it automatically to the man, who at the same time could actually have a family as well, have the same considerations, but it's just assumed, he'll be fine, that it's not going to be an issue. So that's how those kinds of biases play out, and and that's why we have such low representation numbers of women, and in particular women of color.
Catalyst has such a remarkably diverse staff of women that are working towards this cause. I want to talk a little bit about some of your grassroots work on the ground, helping to close this gap across the spectrum here.
So what we do, the way that our model works, Catalyst is a global nonprofit organization, and our mission is to create workplaces that work for women, because what we found is that when you create a workplace that works for women, it works for everybody, because doing these things by getting rid of biases and making and building a more inclusive workplace, it's a benefit for all. It's not an accommodation for a few, but a benefit for all. And so what we do is, our approach is a little bit different in that we work with companies. So it's the large Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 organizations that we work with to break down the barriers that are created by systemic racism and systemic sexism.
Racial disparities have existed in the housing world long before there was a pandemic.
Coming up, the housing crisis made worse by COVID-19. Many Black and Latinx renters in fear of losing their housing. Experts weigh in after the break. Stay with us. Welcome back. Another area of the economy fraught with racial disparities is housing. The California Housing Partnership helps to preserve and expand the supply of homes affordable to low-income households. Their research shows serious racial disparities in housing security, especially right now.
For you, before COVID-19, can you tell me about housing inequities for the Black and Latinx communities?
Absolutely, Greg. And I think what's critical for me and for everyone else to acknowledge is, racial disparities have existed in the housing world long before there was a pandemic. So this was already a bad situation from decades of systemic, structural, discriminatory practices in the real estate and finance worlds that have resulted in increasingly segregated communities. Again, feels like Back to the Future in a lot of bad ways. And then what we realized quickly is how much worse the pandemic is making all of this. So in the 11 weeks of the census survey data that we looked at, we found, as you would expect, a larger share of Latinx and Black renters reporting having very little confidence in their ability to retain their housing, if they had some, because of course there's some folks who are homeless, and very little confidence that come next month, now it's this month after the federal unemployment supplemental insurance runs out, that they can pay for next month. In the most recent week of data, 43% of Latinx renters and 41% of Black renters said they had no or very little confidence they can pay their rent next month. That compares to 33% of Asian American renters and 25% of white renters. So there's some real disparities here, and they've gotten a lot worse.
Now, we've talked kind of at length about this eviction bomb that could potentially go off as some of these moratoriums go away. And we've talked about the impact that could have on the health and well-being of these communities of color. How worrisome is that for your organization?
Very worrisome. It's, our whole purpose of the California Housing Partnership is to to house the homeless and to make sure that we have enough supply of housing so that we stop the segregation of our communities that's happening now as low-income service workers have been driven further and further out from job centers and exclusionary neighborhoods. So these trends are just accelerating things that were already going on, Greg. And it's absolutely critical. We're going to need all levels of government to dig in, to push back hard, even harder than the efforts we'd had on the table. One of those is the HEROES Act, which you may have heard would provide direct rental assistance, almost $200 billion of direct assistance to particularly low-income renters who are in this fragile state we're talking about. And then there's also the Moving Forward Act, House Resolution 2, which is also now waiting for action in the Senate. And that would invest about $100 billion of new emergency capital to make sure that the pipeline of affordable home production that frankly has gotten stalled at the state level right now can move forward again at the volume it should.
Addressing not just the short term, but in really targeting those core issues that have made us get to where we are today. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, great. And I'm glad you're bringing up the connection. There's a very powerful connection between what's happening at the moment in the pandemic and what we were already facing statewide in California. We already had this huge challenge with people unhoused on the streets, over 150,000 people struggling to find shelter. And we already had a deficit of 1.3 million homes. People who didn't have access to affordable homes were paying 2 and sometimes more than 50% of their income to find what shelter they could. So what we haven't had, Greg, is this. We haven't had a Marshall Plan for affordable housing, like what we did together as a society after World War II. We invested at every level in a strategic way with a long-term horizon. So my organization, the California Housing Partnership, is partnering with Housing California, a big tent organization for homelessness and affordable housing in Sacramento. And the two of us have put together a Marshall Plan for affordable homes called the Roadmap Home 2030. And this plan involves the top researchers from across California universities. It also involves more than 30 of the top policymakers. And what we have on the table, which is unfortunately not quite ready for release yet, is 40 to 50 policy initiatives that, if they're taken together at the state level and they're done in a sustained way over an 8 to 10 year time period, we think will go, if not solve our homeless and affordable housing gaps, go a long way in that direction.
When it comes to the Bay Area specifically, the cost of rent has continued to go up. How has that continued to affect those communities of color when it comes to these inequities?
As housing prices increased, Black and Latinx renters in particular were displaced at a much higher rate than other ethnic racial groups. And so we know that this trend already existed, and pushing Black and brown people out of the Bay Area. And the pandemic has unfortunately accelerated that trend.
With disparities in mind, San Francisco's planning department has put racial and social equity at the forefront of its housing plan for the first time. The goal is to address immediate issues and create lasting change.
Miriam, thanks for joining us. I want to talk about Housing Element 22 update, which really is the city's way of focusing on racial and social equity through housing. Just tell me the major tenets of that.
So as you know, this is our housing plan. This is the housing element is our umbrella document to define what our priorities are, what our vision for housing our people is, how we want to prioritize our tasks. What is interesting and challenging about housing element is that this is the first housing plan in San Francisco that is centered on racial and social equity. And this is obviously in response to the pressures that we're facing right now, but this is also to address some of the structural historical challenges that we've been dealing with in terms of racial discrimination, racial segregation within the city. And while this is happening right now, as we are experiencing COVID-19, there has been a lot of substantial work within the city to guide us in that direction. But the housing plan is to address the challenges today, but also how we want to see San Francisco tomorrow. It's not just to recover from the crisis, but it's to figure out a city where we can appropriately shelter our folks, especially addressing the needs of the American Indian community, of the Black community, of the Latinx community, and the many other communities of color.
When you're putting racial and social equity first and at the center of this plan, does that mean more affordable housing, less displacement? What are some of the driving factors in assuring that those communities are taken care of?
Right. So as it has been a substantial discussion in the city, we need to provide more housing because one of the challenges is the overcrowding conditions. Some of the challenges that if by choice people are having multi-generational households, that is wonderful and beautiful. But when children have no options, when seniors have no options, again, especially in our communities of color, that becomes a challenge. When we have 3 or 4 families sharing an apartment, that is what's creating some of the focal points for COVID-19 infection. So there is a need to build more affordable housing. We have been behind on the state mandates, on the state regional housing need allocation numbers for low and very low. But it's not just about that. It is about also preserving the affordability that we have. We have a large percent of our units that can be retained affordable permanently. So it's investing in our existing housing stock so we can keep our folks housed, so we don't dislocate our communities. We assure them that they can stay not only in their houses, but they stay in their communities with access to the grocery store, to access with the bakery, access to the church, access to other family members. And there is the third component, which is protection for our tenants. So in a way, the way we have been framing it is the housing strategy is one of protection, preservation, and production. The city will put a lot of knowledge, a lot of effort, a lot of work, but we would only be successful if people engage and convey their voices and convey their visions and convey their challenges. So that can be part of the effort. That can be part of the change that we're pursuing.
Coming up, a historic pick, the presumptive Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden choosing California Senator Kamala Harris as his VP. The impact of the choice next. Stay with us. Politics aside, this week marked a historic moment for the country when Joe Biden named California Senator Kamala Harris as his running mate on the Democratic ticket. Senator Harris is the first Black woman and first South Asian American person nominated to a major party presidential ticket. The Bay Area native is the daughters of immigrants from Jamaica and India. Congresswoman Barbara Lee reflected on the historic moment.
This is just, for me, such a momentous moment. And it's such a historical moment for myself because I have been with Reverend Jackson, with Barack Obama, with Shirley Chisholm, and trying to break through and make this party more inclusive, more democratic.
Sunday. If you want to see any of today's show, you want to rewatch any of these stories, you can see us tonight at 11:30. Have a great night. Excuse me.